Ralph Lauren FW26 27's Runway, classic navy and midnight chic looks. The Midnight Entrance. Welcome to Classy Vibe, where I explore the emotion, elegance, and deeper meaning behind luxury fashion. And today I'm diving into Ralph Lauren FW26 27 Runway, classic navy and midnight chic looks. From the very first moment the runway lights dimmed, I felt transported into a world that was both cinematic and deeply refined. I think Ralph Lauren has always understood how to create atmosphere, but this collection felt especially intimate and confident. The power of navy. As the opening looks appeared, I immediately noticed how dominant navy blue became throughout the collection. I think navy often gets underestimated because people see it as safe, but in my experience, it can communicate sophistication more effectively than black. There was a softness to these shades that made the tailoring feel approachable rather than intimidating. What I find interesting is how Ralph Lauren transformed navy into something emotional, instead of merely classic. Elegance without excess. One thing I admired instantly was the restraint in the styling. I think many modern runway collections try too hard to impress through shock value, but this show relied on quiet confidence instead. Unlike most people who associate luxury with extravagance, I believe true elegance often comes from discipline and simplicity. The collection proved that you don't need loud designs to leave a lasting impression. Tailoring that speaks. The tailoring throughout the show was honestly breathtaking to me. In my experience, perfect tailoring creates a sense of authority without saying a word. And that energy was everywhere here. Jackets were sculpted with precision, yet they still moved naturally with the body. What I find interesting is how the structure never felt rigid, which made the entire collection feel alive rather than overly polished. The midnight mood. There was a cinematic darkness woven into the runway that I found unforgettable. I think the midnight tones gave the collection a mysterious edge, while still maintaining Ralph Lauren's timeless identity. Certain looks almost reminded me of old Hollywood films, but with a modern sharpness layered underneath. It created a mood that felt nostalgic and futuristic at the same time. Textures over color. Because the palette remained relatively controlled, the textures became incredibly important. I think this was one of the smartest creative decisions in the collection because it forced viewers to pay attention to craftsmanship. Velvet, satin, wool, and soft leather created depth that color alone could never achieve. In my experience, texture is often what separates expensive-looking fashion from truly luxurious fashion. The quiet strength of minimalism. What surprised me most was how minimal many of the silhouettes actually were. I think people sometimes assume minimalism is boring, but this runway reminded me that simplicity can carry enormous emotional weight. What I find interesting is how the clean lines allowed every movement and detail to stand out more clearly. The restraint itself became the statement. masculine and feminine energy. I noticed a fascinating balance between masculine tailoring and feminine elegance throughout the collection. In my experience, the best fashion often exists somewhere between those two energies rather than fully committing to one side. Some oversized coats carried a commanding presence, while softer fabrics introduced vulnerability and grace. I think that contrast made the collection feel emotionally layered instead of visually predictable. Why classic still wins. Watching this runway reminded me why classic fashion continues to survive every trend cycle. I think trends create excitement, but timeless design creates emotional attachment. Unlike fast-moving social media aesthetics, Ralph Lauren understands the value of longevity. What I find interesting is that many younger audiences are now rediscovering classic tailoring precisely because modern fashion has become so chaotic. A surprisingly modern collection. Even though the collection embraced tradition, I never felt like I was watching something outdated. I think the styling choices gave these looks a contemporary sharpness that kept everything relevant. Certain proportions and layering techniques felt distinctly modern without looking forced. In my experience, updating heritage fashion subtly is far more effective than completely reinventing it. The emotional side of luxury. There's something emotional about Ralph Lauren collections that I rarely feel with other luxury brands. I think it comes from the storytelling embedded in every silhouette and fabric choice. What I find interesting is that the runway felt less like a fashion presentation and more like entering someone's beautifully imagined world. That emotional connection is what keeps people loyal to certain brands for decades. The confidence factor. Confidence was probably the strongest theme I took away from the show. I think every look communicated self-assurance without needing aggressive styling or dramatic theatrics. In my experience, clothing becomes truly powerful when it enhances the wearer instead of overpowering them. This collection felt designed for women who already know exactly who they are. Luxury that feels wearable. Another detail I appreciated was how wearable many of the looks actually seemed. I think high fashion sometimes disconnects from reality, but Ralph Lauren maintained practicality without sacrificing beauty. The coats, trousers, and layered evening pieces all felt like they could genuinely exist beyond the runway. What I find interesting is how difficult it is to create wearable luxury without becoming boring. The art of styling. The styling throughout the presentation felt incredibly intentional to me. I think accessories were used with remarkable restraint, which allowed the garments themselves to remain the focus. In my experience, over-accessorizing often weakens sophisticated looks rather than improving them. Here, every boot, glove, and handbag felt like part of a carefully controlled visual language. A different kind of glamour. What really stayed with me was the understated glamour running through the collection. Unlike most people who associate glamour with sparkle and excess, I believe true glamour often appears quieter and more mysterious. The midnight tones, sleek tailoring, and fluid movement created an elegance that felt deeply mature. It wasn't trying to demand attention, and somehow that made it even more captivating. Fashion beyond trends. As the runway continued, I kept thinking about how rare it is to see a collection that feels disconnected from temporary trends. I think Ralph Lauren understands that fashion becomes more meaningful when it transcends a specific season. What I find interesting is how these looks could still feel elegant 10 years from now. That kind of timelessness is becoming increasingly rare in modern fashion. The viewer's perspective. While watching the show, I found myself wondering how different audiences would interpret these looks. Would younger viewers appreciate the restraint, or would they prefer something louder and more experimental? In my experience, collections like this reveal more over time rather than instantly. I think that slower emotional impact is actually a sign of stronger design. The final walk. As the final looks appeared, there was a calm confidence that lingered over the entire runway. I think the closing moments reinforced the collection's message about timeless sophistication and emotional depth. What I find interesting is how the show never relied on dramatic finales or shocking twists to feel memorable. Instead, it trusted consistency and craftsmanship to leave the lasting impression. lasting reflection. As I close today's discussion on Classy Vibe, I keep thinking about how this collection balanced tradition and modernity with such effortless confidence. I think Ralph Lauren reminded us that elegance never truly disappears. It simply evolves with each generation. What about you? Do you prefer bold, trend-driven fashion? Or are you more drawn to timeless and understated luxury?